Hello, grammarians! Now, we've already talked about how verbs can show actions and link concepts, and today I'd like to talk about a third function of the verb, which is helping other verbs. Now, we call this the helping verb, you may have heard it called that, or the auxiliary verb. These are just two words for the same thing. Auxiliary is just a more Latin way to say helping, that's all it means. Now, I've brought along an image of my friend Brian to help explain this principle. What helping verbs are is really just inflected forms of the verbs to have and to be. And as we get deeper into the verb, I'll explain what each one means in each one of its different versions. But for now, suffice it to say that I'm just going to throw out some examples, just so you can see what it means for a helping verb to be a helping verb. So the specific way in which helping verbs help is that they establish certain facts about a sentence, usually when they're happening in time. And we'll get more and more into that as we get more into tenses and aspect, but I just want to give you some examples. So here we have, Brian is eating a pizza. Brian and I love pizza. We used to eat a lot of pizza. Brian has eaten a pizza. Brian was eating a pizza. And finally, Brian had been eating a pizza. So the presence of all these helping verbs has different effects depending on which ones you use. And as I said, we'll get into those later, but just for a brief overview, for example, let's see, Brian is eating a pizza, that suggests that it's going on now. Brian has eaten a pizza, that means he had done it, it's over in the past. Brian was eating a pizza, which means he was in the middle of eating a pizza when something happened. And finally, Brian had been eating a pizza. So he was doing it, and then he stopped at some point in time. And this is just the most basic introduction to helping verbs. So, verbs can show actions, verbs can link concepts, and verbs can help other verbs. You can learn anything. David out. Hello, grammarians. Today we're talking about verbs and bears. So we had previously established at least one thing about the verb, and that was that it can show actions. But today I'd like to introduce the idea that the verb can link ideas to one another. And in fact, we have this whole class of verbs that we call linking verbs. Or if you want to call it something fancier, we call that state of being verbs. These linking verbs include all forms of the verb to be, which I have handily written out for you. So I am, he is, we are, be nice, they were being, they have been, he was, we were. Now we use a linking verb when we want to connect one idea to another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the screen in half between the action side and the state of being side, just to show you what I mean. So we use action verbs to show what something does, whereas we use state of being verbs to show what something is. So let's bring it back to this bear. Let's think of an action for this bear to do. What is a bear-like thing to do? The bear eats a fish. That's an action. That's something the bear is doing. The bear is hungry, however, is not something that the bear is doing, it's something that the bear is. So what is doing here is connecting the word hungry to the word bear. It's linking it. Some verbs can be used both ways. They can be used both as actions and as linking verbs, and I'll show you an example of that. You could say, the bear looked at me, which is to say the bear is doing a thing, looking at something, namely me. But we could also say, using the same verb, the bear looked lonely. Now, in this case, this is describing how the bear looks, what the bear looks like. This looking is not something the bear is doing, it is how the bear appears to a viewer. So, looked is connecting lonely to bear. It is linking lonely to bear. It is a linking verb. By the same token, we could say for an action, the bear smells a person. What is it smelling? A person. But we could also say the bear smells like cinnamon, which I grant you is pretty unlikely. Don't go smelling bears. But what smells is doing here is connecting the idea of cinnamon to the bear. The bear isn't smelling cinnamon, the bear smells like cinnamon. And that's the difference between a linking verb and an action verb. As a linking verb shows what something is, an action verb shows what something does. So the bear is hungry, the bear looked lonely, the bear smells like cinnamon. These all reflect something about what the bear is, how it's being. You can learn anything. David out. Hello, grammarians. Today we're going to talk about a class of auxiliary or helper verbs called the modal verbs. These are verbs that have special properties and help other verbs. But what is modality? My fellow grammarian, I am so glad you asked. Modality is when we use these verbs to express conditions on stuff. So we can use these verbs to determine if something is likely to happen or certain to have happened, whether or not something is possible or whether or not we have the ability to do something, whether or not we have the permission to do something, and whether or not we have the obligation or requirement or need to do something. You already know all of these verbs, I promise you. You just didn't know this name for them. Let's meet the modals. Roll call, here we go. May, might, must, can, could, shall, should, will, would. Those are the modals. So here's what modal verbs can do. Thing number one, they agree with everything. So you can take any one of these modals and you can use any subject in the world and it's not going to change, right? You take a word like talk, for instance, and you'd say, I talk, Diane talks. Right, you add the S. But any subject in any sentence is going to take the modal verb the same way. Let me show you. I can do it, you can do it, she can do it, they can do it, we can do it. It's all the same. They agree with everything. Something else that modals do is actually something that they don't do. They don't have a to form. This is what we call the infinitive. So there's no such thing as to may or to could. That just doesn't exist. So modals don't have infinitives. You can't say, I want to should. It doesn't. That is an illegal operation in English. It is ungrammatical. It doesn't matter what version of English you speak. Across all varieties of English, you cannot to should. And finally, a thing that modal verbs can do is indicate modality, which, like we said, establishes conditions. So let's take a look at some examples. So the word must, right? We can use the word must in a couple of different ways. So if you imagine a detective looking up from some tracks, some muddy boot prints on the floor with her magnifying glass, she looks up and she says, he must have gone that way. That detective is using must to express like a likelihood, a high likelihood. This must have happened. But if you're at an amusement park and the roller coaster you want to ride has a height requirement, the sign probably says, you must be this tall to ride the Doom coaster. This is like a necessary condition. By a similar token, if you enter someone's house and they demand that you take off your shoes, they would say, you must remove your shoes. Similarly, with may, we can use may to express a possibility, like saying it may rain, that's something that could possibly happen, or to give someone permission, like you may enter. You can use a word like can to express ability. You could say, I can eat 10 pounds of broccoli, and that's expressing your ability to do a thing. We also use modal verbs like this to talk about conditions or stuff that isn't going to happen or maybe could happen. And so, for example, in this sentence, we would say, I would make the bed, but I'm tired. Because the possibility exists, however remote, that the bed would be made by me, but I don't feel like it. So I'm using would to offer an excuse. I'm saying this could possibly happen, this would happen, except for this one other problem, which is that I'm sleepy. You can also use modal verbs to give advice to someone, as in, you shouldn't do that. And something that is special to will, and to a lesser extent shall, is that they can form the future. Shall used to be a lot more popular, and it still is in British English, but less so in Standard American. So you would say, he will win the competition, or he shall win the competition. And use of this modal verb, will or shall, indicates that that thing that you're talking about is happening in the future. These verbs are very powerful. You should learn how to use them, and in fact, if you can complete the exercises, then you will master these tricky verbs. You can learn anything. David out.